Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in session number 5 of our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the QME. And I have a fascinating discussion for you today, one that I'm sure that's going to help you in your very next evaluation that involves your permanent impairment determination. So let's just get on the same page as to where we are in this program. In session number 1 of this program, we laid the foundation and the philosophy for the program, and we talked about how qualified medical evaluators typically struggle in 3 main areas of their report writing. They struggle in the areas wherein they have to sit down and concentrate for an extended period of time to come up with opinions and conclusions that qualify as substantial medical evidence in the 3 basic difficult decision-making areas, including AOE-COE, including the permanent impairment determination, and then number 3, the greatest struggle for qualified medical evaluators is in coming up with the apportionment approximate percentages. And the philosophy of this program is that these determinations need not be difficult for you at all if you can avail yourself of a couple of basic tools in each one of these decision-making areas. So there's a few tools that will help you in the AOE-COE determination. There's a few tools that will help you arrive at accurate permanent impairment percentages. There are a few tools that will help you arrive at the perfectly naturally correct apportionment approximate percentages. And these tools work in every single case, every single time. So we spent 2 entire sessions as to how to arrive at a true and accurate and appropriate determination for AOE for industrial injury or AOE-COE against industrial injury in the specific and difficult scenario which involved the post-employment cumulative trauma injury claim, which is a claim that currently is flooding the desks of qualified medical evaluators throughout the entire state of California. And qualified medical evaluators tell me that arriving at a correct determination is very, very difficult on these cases. And I shared with you some exact tools known as the causation algorithm that will help you. If you just follow the steps of the causation algorithm, you cannot make an incorrect determination on the AOE-COE determination ever if you just simply follow the steps of the causation algorithm. In our last session, we started talking about the accuracy of the permanent impairment. So we began to shift gears from section 1 of this program, which dealt specifically with AOE-COE, and in the second part of this program, we want to discuss the accuracy of the permanent impairment rating, and we began that discussion in our last session. And we're going to continue that discussion in today's session as well. And we laid the foundation for that discussion by agreeing that all parties involved in your case, all parties, such as the examinee, such as the claims administrator, such as the applicant attorney, such as the defense attorney, all parties are concerned for the accuracy, the accuracy of your permanent impairment rating. Once the examinee is declared to be permanent and stationary, and when you determine that the examinee actually has some residual losses of function or losses of use of body parts and body systems, then the concern turns to the accuracy of the permanent impairment rating. We began our last session talking about how your accurate permanent impairment rating factors into the system, into the determination of the examinee's permanent disability rating, as your permanent impairment rating is used down at the disability evaluation unit by the disability raters. And we talked about how to establish the accuracy of your permanent impairment rating. In today's session, I want to share with you a couple of case examples to share with you how qualified medical evaluators have used the AMA guides, both under the strict application of the AMA guides and then also under Alvarez and Guzman, to accomplish just that objective, which is to arrive at accurate permanent impairment determinations for their particular examinee. And I want to share with you some creative uses of the AMA guides under both the strict application of the AMA guides and then also under Alvarez and Guzman. And to illustrate the philosophy of today's discussion, I want to share with you an experience that I had recently where I was called to deposition more than a year after I had a face-to-face evaluation with an injured worker. It seems like it takes time for some of these cases to reach a resolution. And this case had several particular twists and turns to it, so I was not surprised to learn that it was still unresolved. And the parties requested my deposition. And as I was reviewing and preparing for the deposition and reviewing my reporting on this particular examinee, I found some errors, some shortcomings, some possible inconsistencies, some weak spots in my own reporting on the case. Now, when I wrote the report, all of those sections of my report that I'm admitting to you now that may have been weak, all of those sections at the time seemed to me to be perfectly shored up and perfectly tight and perfectly ready for submission at that time. But when it came time to prepare for the deposition and I reviewed my reporting, I found some areas where my reporting was not as strong as it could be or as strong as it should be, and I had reason to doubt my own conclusions. Well, during deposition, because those opinions and conclusions related to the examinee's permanent impairment percentage and her apportionment approximate percentages, in other words, because my opinions and conclusions factored into the financial drivers of the case, it became important for me to admit to the parties that there was possibly some shortcomings in my own opinions and conclusions. And I want to share with you how that unfolded during the deposition itself. So I have the deposition transcript here, and I want to share with you how those passages played out in the deposition. And the purpose of doing this with you is to confirm and reiterate to you that all the parties are concerned is with accuracy. Accuracy, okay? So the defense attorney was asking me some questions, and I'll just read them to you so you can see actually how this played out. She said, is it accurate that your opinion as it pertains to the cervical spine and as documented on page 60 in your report is such that the applicant did not sustain injury, AOE-COE, to her cervical spine as a result of the March 3rd, 2015 date of injury? So this was a question regarding AOE-COE. And I said, yes, but now with a new review of my report, I have some reason to question that conclusion. So I raised up to the parties at the deposition that perhaps my own conclusion at the time was not accurate. So that threw a monkey wrench into the spokes of the defense attorney's questioning, and she followed up and she said, can you explain what that reasoning is, doctor? And I said, well, my concern is for the accuracy of the permanent impairment rating and the apportionment determination for Mrs. Jones, and upon reviewing my file in preparation for today's deposition, I see that there's a finding on 1231 MRI which may not have received adequate consideration at the time. In other words, there's a finding on MRI which may suggest that she indeed did suffer an industrial injury, AOE-COE, to her cervical spine, that perhaps I didn't adequately consider it at the time. And So I went on to explain about the particular finding in the MRI, and how that finding could indicate a new injury to the cervical spine, and that perhaps I needed, before the case was actually concluded, I needed to take another look at that in order to provide opinions and conclusions that were accurate. And so I concluded by saying, so in all fairness to Mrs. Jones, this is not a finding that I considered at the time, and now in retrospect it seems relevant in terms of providing the proper determination for her on the permanent impairment and also on the apportionment. I'm not yet clear as to how the investigation in this is going to unfold or would unfold if you authorize me to further investigate that, but I believe that it needs to be further followed up and further developed. So based upon this, the parties decided that a new face-to-face evaluation was necessary to investigate this particular issue in order to arrive at the proper and accurate determination for this particular examinee. And then similarly, later on in the deposition, as the questioning turned to the applicant attorney was asking questions now about the knee, and a lot of questions about the knee. And when he seemed to be wrapping up his questioning about the knee, I said to him, I said, before you leave the knee, let me know, okay? Because I have a comment regarding the knee. So this is me coming forward and introducing a new idea as the deponent, rather than the deposers doing all of the interrogating and all of the development of the deposition. So I actually raised my hand to raise an issue that I felt was not handled properly and accurately the first time through. So the applicant attorney says, I think I am leaving the knee, so by all means I'd appreciate your comment. I said, okay. So similar to what I said earlier regarding the new finding on MRI related to the cervical spine, now in retrospect, as I review my report regarding the apportionment of the right knee impairment, which is on page 67, are we all together on page 67? I said, I provided for 0% impairment due to the industrial injury and 100% due to other factors. And my reasoning for that is that I ascribe a slight gait derangement as being responsible for her knee pain condition and her knee impairment. So I provided for a permanent impairment rating for the knee, but I apportioned all of that permanent impairment rating out by ascribing her knee impairment as being secondary to a gait derangement. Okay? So I said, however, in reviewing my report, I realized that I did not do an adequate investigation into the gait derangement. In fact, we did not do a formal gait analysis in this case due to time constraints. For example, I was with Mrs. Jones for approximately 5 hours and we simply ran out of time, so a formal gait analysis is lacking. In other words, the basis for the apportionment determination, which was a gait derangement, the analysis or the examination of the gait was missing. So the foundation for the apportionment was missing. And I caught this on my review of my first report. So I went on and I said, further, Mrs. Jones herself describes no impairment of gait. In fact, she states she walks daily for exercise. So I realized in providing for apportionment due to a gait derangement, I did not have the relevant facts at the time to support that determination, and that requires a further investigation in order to provide an accurate apportionment determination. So in this case, I myself found 2 inaccuracies in my reporting that dramatically impacted the opinions and conclusions on the report. And the parties were willing to schedule a new face-to-face evaluation at great expense and also consuming great additional time, because the sole purpose of those 2 measures is to arrive finally at an opinion at an impairment percentage and an apportionment approximate percentage that are accurate. So accuracy is central, accuracy is key, and in today's discussion I want to share with you a couple of case examples that illustrate these principles. So with that as our introduction, let's begin today's discussion, which is session number 5 of our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the QME, and today we're concerned with the accuracy of the permanent impairment ratings. Okay, so let's begin. In today's session, I want to share with you some case examples to illustrate how qualified medical evaluators have used the AMA guides both under the strict application of the AMA guides and then also under Alvarez and Guzman to come up with permanent impairment ratings that, in their opinion, were the most accurate description of the examinee's true condition. And one of the principles that I want to share with you during the course of today's discussion is that when it comes time for you to provide your permanent impairment rating for your examinee, many times your examinee's impairment can be described in a handful of different ways. It's not just described under one single method within the AMA guides. Many times any particular condition can be described with 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 myriad different descriptions, all of which are from the AMA guides. Now, our job as qualified medical evaluators is to provide the rating from among the potential options available to us, is to provide the rating that's the most accurate rating. That's the key phrase, is most accurate. So our obligation as qualified medical evaluators is to consider the entire range, the entire spectrum of possible impairment ratings that describe our examinee's condition, and to select from that list the rating that is the most accurate description of their true impairment. So accuracy is key, and I want to share with you just a couple of examples to show you how qualified medical evaluators have used the pain add-on to accurately describe the examinee's impairment. That's under the strict application of the AMA guides. And then I want to share with you a couple of examples under Alvarez and Guzman. Number one, which is a very popular discussion nowadays, has to do with adding versus combining impairments. And there are many good reasons why impairments should be added versus combined using the combined values chart. And I'll share with you a case that illustrates that principle perfectly. And then we want to talk about permanent impairment ratings that are created by analogy to conditions that have same or similar losses for activities of daily living. And this is an impairment rating method upon which you're going to rely greatly in the future. And that has to do with providing permanent impairment ratings for conditions that may not be listed in the guides by creating an analogy to conditions that are listed in the guides, or by creating analogies to conditions that cause same or similar impairments or same or similar losses for activities of daily living as conditions that are described in the AMA guides. So it's the creation of analogies to activities of daily living losses to most accurately describe your examinee's permanent impairment. Okay, so let's begin with a couple of case discussions. Now, when it comes to providing for permanent impairment ratings that are accurate permanent impairment ratings are going to be described under two basic categories. Number one is under the strict application of the AMA guides, and then number two is under an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman. And many qualified medical evaluators are daunted by the whole concept of Alvarez and Guzman and alternative impairment ratings. But it's now required that in every single case wherein you provide a permanent impairment rating for your examinee, that you first provide a permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides, and that you also consider the possibility of other alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman in every single case. Now, let me clarify that just a little bit. It's not required that you provide an alternative impairment rating in every single case. In fact, some qualified medical evaluators have never provided an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman. It's not required that you provide an alternative impairment rating, but what is required is that you consider any other alternative impairment descriptions for your examinee's condition that may be more accurate than the description that's provided under the strict application of the AMA guides. So you're required to demonstrate to the parties that at least you considered the possibility that the examinee may qualify for an alternative impairment rating, but that in your discretion and your medical decision making within your expertise, you decided that an alternative impairment rating was not appropriate or was not the most accurate description of your examinee's actual condition. So we have some case law that I want to share with you in just a minute that confirms to us that a consideration of Alvarez-Guzman alternative impairment ratings is required in every case involving permanent impairment and as part of a complete, what's called a complete medical evaluation. Now, if you fail to consider whether or not an alternative impairment rating is the most accurate description of your examinee's true impairment, you can be accused of failing to provide a complete medical evaluation. And reading directly from the Guzman case itself, Guzman told us that in order to accommodate those complex or extraordinary cases, meaning cases wherein the permanent impairment rating is not very clearly or is not addressed at all in the AMA guides, the AMA guides calls for the physician's exercise of clinical judgment to evaluate the impairment most accurately. The AMA guides calls for the physician's exercise of clinical judgment to evaluate the impairment most accurately. Key phrase. Central to our entire discussion today is that you provide the impairment rating from among the entire spectrum of ratings that describe your examinee's condition, that you provide the rating that among all of those is the most accurate description. Even if that is possible only by resorting to comparable conditions described in the guides. And when we talk about comparable conditions, we're talking about making analogies to conditions in the guides and analogizing those conditions and those impairments to our examinee's condition and our examinee's impairment. And a case that illustrates this principle perfectly, the principle that you as the qualified medical evaluator are charged with the responsibility of providing the permanent impairment rating that's the most accurate assessment of the examinee's true condition, is the 2014 case Sainith versus Wells Fargo Bank, wherein the qualified medical evaluator was replaced through the issuance of a replacement panel. And I'll show you how the QME replacement panel process works in just a moment. The QME was replaced for refusing to consider an alternative rating under Alvarez and Guzman. And in his reporting, the qualified medical evaluator actually stated this in his reporting. And here I have a quote from that report. He stated that in regard to the question of Alvarez-Guzman, I am in agreement and I am of a mind with the primary treating physician in that Alvarez-Guzman is basically a legalistic ploy that attempts to insinuate subjective complaints as a factor in an impairment rating. And he says, like the primary treating physician, I use the AMA guides and do not and never will use Alvarez-Guzman in attempting to most accurately describe my examinee's permanent impairment. And here the qualified medical evaluator made a fatal flaw that resulted in his being replaced as the evaluator on the case. Now, what the Qualified Medical Evaluator could have done a little bit better is he could have said, in my opinion, there are no other alternative impairment ratings within the four corners of the AMA guides that more accurately describe my examinee's condition, and therefore I rely upon the permanent impairment rating provided under the strict interpretation of the AMA guides. In other words, this Qualified Medical Evaluator and us as Qualified Medical Evaluators, we're not required to provide an alternative impairment rating. That's not the requirement. The requirement is that we consider an alternative impairment rating. And here, this Qualified Medical Evaluator said not only is he not going to provide an alternative impairment rating, he's not even going to consider an alternative impairment rating. And for that reason, he was replaced through the issuance of a QME replacement panel. So in this case, it was likely the applicant attorney who determined that the Qualified Medical Evaluator needed to be replaced, and the the applicant attorney used the QME replacement panel process to replace this Qualified Medical Evaluator for failing to consider that an alternative impairment rating may be the most accurate rating for the applicant attorney's client. Remember that when you provide for an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, that typically, not in every single case, but typically has the net effect of doubling, tripling, quadrupling, or in some way increasing the impairment rating compared to the impairment rating that's provided under the strict application of the AMA guides. So likely in this case, it was the applicant attorney that needed to find a Qualified Medical Evaluator who would at least consider that alternative impairment rating was appropriate for his client. And he used the QME replacement panel process to replace this particular QME. So QME replacement panels are issued and determined to be necessary under CCR 31.5. So let me just read to you the section of this code of regulation that was applicable in this particular circumstance. Section A tells us a replacement QME to a panel shall be selected at random by the medical director and provided upon request whenever any of the following occurs. And CCR 31.5 has any number of circumstances that allow for the replacement of the panel Qualified Medical Evaluator, but operative in this particular case was Section 15, which stated that the selected medical evaluator, who otherwise appears to be qualified and competent to address all disputed medical issues, refuses to provide, when requested by a party or by the medical director, a complete medical evaluation. So in this case, the applicant attorney asked the Qualified Medical Evaluator, is it possible that an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman is a more accurate description of my client's impairment than is the strict impairment rating provided for under the strict application of the AMA guides? And the Qualified Medical Evaluator refused to even consider that possibility. And so that qualified as an incomplete versus a complete medical evaluation, and the Qualified Medical Evaluator was promptly replaced. Now, who's to say what happened with the subsequent medical evaluator? The subsequent medical evaluator may not have even issued an alternative impairment rating in the case, but if he at least demonstrated that he considered an alternative impairment rating, then his opinion could be considered to be a complete medical evaluation, and his opinion on the permanent impairment would thus be upheld. So here's how you can phrase it in your report if you decide that an alternative impairment rating is not necessary, is not appropriate, is not more accurate than the impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides. Here's how you can phrase it in your report to demonstrate to the parties that you considered the range and the spectrum of impairment ratings available to you in the four corners of the AMA guides, but you didn't find any of them to be more accurate than the impairment rating that you already came up with. So here's how you can phrase that in your report. So you phrase that in your report with the following phraseology. And the purpose of this phraseology is to demonstrate to the readers of your report, particularly the attorneys involved in your case, that you considered alternative impairment ratings, but you elected for the permanent impairment rating provided for under the strict application of the AMA guides, and as such, your evaluation can be considered a complete evaluation because you considered the range of possibilities. Again, all the parties are concerned with is accuracy, and there's no one single way to describe any single impairment that your examinee may have. There are multiple descriptions of each and every impairment, and you're required to provide the description that's the most accurate of those. And so you demonstrate to the parties that you did that with the following phrase, and you include this in the permanent impairment rating section of your report. You tell the parties that, in my opinion and within reasonable medical probability, the above permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides is the most accurate, and I would put most accurate in italics to make it stand out from the surrounding text. And it's a key phrase in assigning your permanent impairment percentages. Key phrase is the most accurate percentage. So put most accurate here in italics. Is the most accurate description of Mrs. Smith's impairments. I do not find a need to consult with other charts, chapters, or tables within the four corners of the AMA guides to more accurately describe the impairment. And with this simple phrase, little tiny paragraph, you demonstrate to the party that, number one, you considered alternative impairment ratings and you discarded them and you elected for the strict impairment rating under the AMA guides as the most accurate description of the examinee's actual impairment. So this is how you handle those cases when you elect against an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman. Now, let's go on to review a couple of case examples that demonstrate these principles and talk about number one, pain-related impairment, the 3% add-on for pain-related impairment. I'll share with you how how three qualified medical evaluators in the same case handled that particular 3% pain add-on. And then let's talk about adding versus combining impairments, since that seems to be a particularly hot topic in this day and age. Okay, so let's begin with the Schweikert versus State of California case and talk about pain-related impairment. Okay, so here we have the Schweikert versus State of California case, and this case relates to the 3% add-on for pain. Now, the Schweikert case is a 3% add-on for pain on steroids case because in this particular case, there is more than one 3% add-on for pain provided for this particular examinee's impairment. So let's just briefly review this case, and this will hopefully open your mind to the possibilities that are available to you to most accurately describe your examinee's true impairment when the examinee is additionally burdened by the impairment of pain. So the defendant sought reconsideration of the findings of fact, award, and opinion from the workers' compensation judge, and the defendant contended that the disability rating is incorrect because it includes whole person impairment for the lumbar spine, and that's not relevant for our case, but that the applicant is not entitled to three separate 3% pain add-ons. Three separate 3% pain add-ons. That totals a total of 9% whole person impairment as add-on impairment for pain provided 3 times. So let's go through this very quickly. Regarding the July 13, 2009 injury claim, applicant was evaluated by 4 agreed medical evaluators. 4 agreed medical evaluators. So for the neuromusculoskeletal and internal medicine issues, the first qualified medical evaluator provided for 29% whole person impairment with an additional 3% impairment from Chapter 18, which would equal 31% whole person impairment. So here is one 3% add-on for pain. The next evaluator provided for 8% whole person impairment with an additional 3% for pain for a total of 11% whole person impairment. Now mind you, this 8% under DRE cervical category 2, remember that the range of impairments for the DRE cervical category 2 is 5 to 8%, with that additional 3% discretionary range to be used by the qualified medical evaluator in describing an examinee who fits into DRE cervical category 2 but for whom has additional and worsened pain and worsened symptoms and worsened limitations with activities of daily living than would otherwise be provided for by the 5% rating. So in providing for an 8% whole person impairment rating, this qualified medical evaluator already used once a discretionary 3% add-on, but in addition to that, added an additional 3% discretionary add-on to total 11% whole person impairment for the cervical spine. And then finally, the internal medicine provider provided for 10% upper extremity impairment, which converts to 6% whole person impairment. And again, for the third time, this qualified medical evaluator provided an add-on of another 3% for pain symptoms for a total 9% whole person impairment. Well, of course, to this, the defendant contended that the applicant is not entitled to more than one 3% pain add-on. And the appeals board overturned the defendant's objection and upheld the workers' compensation judge's order, and they explained on the next page that here each of the reporting AME doctors explained why. They explained why the recommended whole person impairment, including the pain add-on, accurately, and see here the key phrase is accurately describe the applicant's disability caused by the injury, and the analysis by each of the doctors appears to be consistent with the applicable law, and we see no good reason to disturb the workers' compensation judge's conclusion on that issue. So in those cases where you believe a 3% add-on for pain is applicable, you should feel free to use that. That's under the strict application of the AMA guides. It doesn't require an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, and it need not be limited, as evidenced by this Schweikert case here, it need not be limited to a single body part, as long as you can adequately describe why your particular whole person impairment rating is the most accurate description of your examinee's true impairment. Okay, the next case I want to share with you is the De La Cerda case, and the De La Cerda case has to deal with adding versus combining impairments. And you may be familiar with the concept of adding versus combining impairments, as was described in the now famous Kite versus East Bay Municipal Utility District case. So just a little philosophy on adding versus combining impairments. The AMA guides tells us that there is no established best way to combine impairments for multiple, whether we're combining for multiple impairments or impairments to multiple body parts. But the guides suggest the use of the combined values chart on page 604 of the AMA guides. Now, the combined values chart has a reductive effect on the final impairment rating, such that if your examinee has two impairment ratings for two separate body parts, such as 10% each, the total final whole person impairment through the use of the combined values chart would come out to be about 18 or 19% whole person impairment versus 20% whole person impairment, which would result from a simple addition of those impairment ratings. And in the KITE case, the Qualified Medical Evaluator added the impairments for impairments due to each hip. KITE had an impairment rating of each hip, and the Qualified Medical Evaluator provided an opinion that because the impairment of one hip had a synergistic effect on the other hip, in other words, the examinee was unable to compensate for his bad left hip because he had a bad right hip. So he was unable to compensate for the impaired left hip. And so therefore, because he was unable to compensate, the impairments had a synergistic or additive effect one upon the other, and those impairment ratings should therefore be added versus combined using the reductive combined values chart. Well, here in the case of Joel Lacerda, the applicant contested the workers' compensation judge's award of 93% permanent disability, contending that the workers' compensation judge should have followed the opinion of the agreed medical evaluator, who stated that to most accurately calculate the extent of the applicant's permanent disability, applicant's impairment ratings should be added rather than combined using the combined values chart. Applicant asserts that the opinion of the AME, if the impairment ratings were added, would result in a finding of 100% permanent disability. So the agreed medical evaluator in this case provided for an impairment rating over 100% whole person impairment by adding compared to combining the permanent impairments, and the workers' compensation judge did not accept that opinion. In fact, he took the impairment ratings, the individual impairment ratings, and processed them through the combined values chart to come up with an impairment, total whole person impairment rating of 93% versus a greater than 100% impairment rating had the impairment ratings been added. So the workers' compensation judge relied upon the impairment ratings of AMEs in psychiatry, orthopedics, and internal medicine to find a 93% permanent disability. In doing so, the workers' compensation judge discounted the opinion of Dr. Reynolds, the AME in internal medicine, who advised that in rating applicants' impairments, the impairments should be added together rather than combined using the combined values chart because, quote, the combination of his orthopedic, gastrointestinal, sleep, and headache impairments causes greater impairment than what would be calculated by using the combined values chart. Hence, adding these individual impairments is more accurate. Now, here he doesn't explain how or why they cause greater disability than what would be calculated, but he simply states that they do. And he went on to say that we have here an unfortunate case where the examinee's present medical condition was caused at least in part by several surgeries. However, with the extent of orthopedic disabilities described by Dr. Roth, his other symptoms, including GERD, sleep disorder, and headaches, have a much greater overall impact on Mr. De Lacerda's activities of daily living than would be accounted for by using the AMA Guide's combined values chart in order to determine an overall impairment rating. In effect, the combination of his multiple impairments caused greater disability than what would be calculated by using the combined values chart. Hence, adding these individual impairments is more accurate. Now again, he doesn't describe how or why they result in a greater impairment than would otherwise be calculated through the use of the combined values chart. He simply states that they do, and in my opinion, his reasoning and the support for it is not strong, but the appeals board saw things differently. So the appeals board tells us that the additive method recommended by Dr. Reynolds was approved in the Kite case versus East Bay Municipal Utility District, where a qualified medical evaluator recommended the addition of separate ratings for the right and left hips as the best way to combine the impairments rather than using the combined values chart, which has a reductive effect and would reduce the overall permanent disability. The QME and Kite opined that there was a synergistic effect, keyword, synergistic effect of the injury to the same body parts bilaterally versus body parts from different regions of the body. And this is an important principle wherein the synergistic effect is perfectly applicable, and that has to do with impairments to multiple body parts where one impairment cannot be compensated for due to the other impairment. In those cases, there is what's referred to as a synergistic effect of one impairment upon the other, and that's a perfect and logical and perfectly reasonable opportunity for you to use the additive method versus the combined method. Well, in this particular case, the qualified medical evaluator made no claim of a synergistic effect of one impairment on the other, and this is one of the bases upon which the defendant, where the workers' compensation judge discounted the additive method versus the combining method through the combined values chart. Well, the appeals board tells us that a synergistic effect is not necessary. Can you believe that? It's not necessary to demonstrate a synergistic effect in order to properly add versus combine the impairments. So here, they tell us that even though the AME did not use the term synergistic to advocate for the use of the additive method, this is not determinative of the validity of using that method. The impairments may be added if substantial medical evidence supports the physician's opinion that adding them will result in a more accurate rating. Again, it's all about the accuracy of the rating of the applicant's level of disability than the rating resulted from the use of the combined values chart. The AME's opinion on the most accurate method for rating applicant's impairment should be followed if he provides a reasonably articulated medical basis, absent good reason to find that opinion unpersuasive. So in this case, even though the qualified medical evaluator provided an additive impairment rating, and even though he explained it, as I pointed out earlier, his explanation as to how and why he chose the additive method versus the combining method was not all that persuasive. And here they admit that as well. And they tell us that to the extent that the workers' compensation judge does not find the justification that the AME articulated for adding the applicant's impairments to be adequate, the AME should be provided an opportunity to clarify the basis for his rating recommendation. Accordingly, we will grant reconsideration and return this matter so that the parties may obtain a supplemental report or deposition from the agreed medical evaluator, Dr. Reynolds. So again, in this case, the agreed medical evaluator chose to use the additive method, and he's halfway home with his additive method. The only thing that remains is for the agreed medical evaluator to provide a good reasoning as to why the additive method should be used compared to the combined values chart or the combining method through the use of the combined values chart. So doctors, aren't those cases fascinating? In each of those two cases that I shared with you, the purpose of going through those cases is to show you some of the options that you have available to you under both the strict application of the AMA guides and also under alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman for providing for an accurate permanent impairment rating. And I wish we had so much more time than this, because this is just scratching the surface of the permanent impairment rating options that you have available to you as a qualified medical evaluator. But basically, we can summarize accuracy and permanent impairment ratings by stating that you're only limited by your imagination. Both the AMA guides and Alvarez and Guzman provide us great latitude and a wide pathway for providing our permanent impairment ratings from anywhere within the four corners of the AMA guides. As long as you can provide a good how and why reasoning as to why your permanent impairment rating is the most accurate description of the examinee's true impairment, then your permanent impairment rating will fly. And in these two cases, which seem to me to be on the far end of the bell-shaped curve, 3 qualified medical evaluators provided for at least 3, and maybe a case may even be made for a 4th 3% discretionary add-on for pain. So that's a mind blower, that you're not limited to only one 3% add-on for pain in providing for an accurate permanent impairment rating. And then under Alvarez and Guzman, and by analogy to the Kite versus East Bay case, you have the opportunity of adding, you have the opportunity of combining, you have the opportunity of subtracting, you have the opportunity of multiplying impairments. Whatever you feel is the most accurate description of the examinee's multiple impairments, you can combine those impairments in any method that you feel is the most accurate, as long as you can explain how and why and make your how and why reasoning substantial medical evidence. Your opinion on the permanent impairment will be upheld. And again, it's all about providing for an accurate permanent impairment rating, and that doesn't necessarily mean the highest permanent impairment rating. What it means is it means in providing the language description, the word phraseology that is the most accurate description of the examinee's true condition. And most conditions can be described by a spectrum of impairments that are described in the AMA guides, and your job, the reason we hire you, is to provide us with the opinion among those that is the most accurate description of the examinee's true impairment. Okay, so I hope that helps you, doctors. In our next session, we're going to tackle the issue that seems to be the most difficult for qualified medical evaluators of all specialties, and that has to do with coming up with your apportionment approximate percentages. And I get calls from doctors all the time, and they ask me, they say, Barry, how do you do it? How do you know if the apportionment approximate percentages are 50-50? Or how do you know if it's 60-40 or 70-30? How do you know when it's 0-100 or 100-0? I mean, how do you know? How do you do it? And let me ask you, do you think that there is a system, that there is a science to determining the apportionment approximate percentages? Well, I'm here to tell you that there is, and I'm going to share that with you on our very next session. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's session. I'm looking forward to being with you on our next session, as well as we continue in our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the QME. For now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.